I'm Paul Maidment, I'm the editor-in-chief of Blouin News, and I'm going to moderate this panel in his stead about the state of the US economy. I have on my immediate left Scott Summer from the Bentley University. To his left, Donald Marin, the Director of Economic Policy Institute at the Urban Institute. To his left, we have Renaud Laplanche, the founder and chief executive officer of the Lending Club. And to his extreme left, we have Dennis Gartman, the founder and chief executive officer of the Gartman Letter. The US economy is in a very finely balanced position at the moment. As we saw from the last Fed meeting's decision, the recovery is robust, but by no means secured. And there is still a lot of doubt about the fragility of it. And I think we'll try and examine some of those points of fragility and strength over the ensuing hour. And I will start, if I may, by just going briefly down the line and asking each of you in just a couple of minutes to make a short introductory statement to outline what you see as the strengths and fragilities of the US economy at this particular point, and then we'll take the conversation from there. And Scott, perhaps you could generously start us off.
Okay. Yeah. So my focus tends to be on monetary policy, and I think it's fairly widely understood that one of the main problems in the last 5 years has been a shortfall in aggregate demand, not enough spending in the economy. That's not a universal view, but it's fairly widely held. What makes my views a little bit more out of the mainstream is I basically blame that on monetary policy failures. So I've been arguing since late 2008 that monetary policy needs to be more aggressive, more stimulative, more unconventional techniques have to be used. Obviously, they can't cut interest rates below zero. And that this is essentially the primary problem. Now, that's not to suggest that there aren't other problems in the US and elsewhere, even more so, I think, in places like Britain, where the supply side problems are probably even worse than the United States. And so those are also a drag on the economy. But primarily, if the problem is demand, the textbook solution is more monetary stimulus, and we simply haven't been as aggressive as necessary. And one other quick point. So one objection I get is that, well, you know, the Fed can't really do much more. But if you go back before the crisis, the general view was that the zero interest rate bound is not really something that inhibits Fed policy. I'll read you a quote from the #1 textbook in monetary economics. Monetary policy can be highly effective in reviving a weak economy, even if short-term interest rates are already near zero. And I think we lost sight of that during this crisis and moved away from monetary policy, sort of gave up on it. So I still think that's really the driving factor. The Fed is thinking of tapering probably around December. That's also kind of a cue that we're not being aggressive enough. If it were really sort of the Fed being out of ammunition, why would they even be contemplating tapering in December? That sort of suggests they're broadly happy with where we are in terms of aggregate demand. So I think we have to rethink that whole connection between demand and the monetary policy and the economy.
Okay, that's a point we should definitely come back to. Donald, how does the world look from your perch?
Sure. So if you look through history, history suggests that if you have a financial crisis, that's really bad for your economy, no surprise, and that it takes years to recover. So here we are, depending on how you want to time things, 5 years later. History suggests it often takes 5-7 years before folks get back on track. We are clearly nowhere near back on track relative to reasonable estimates of what the potential of the US economy is. There's still a large gap of $800 billion a year that's missing in some sense. And so there's obviously things that we ought to be doing to try to close that gap, might be able to do more on monetary policy. I spend my time thinking mostly about fiscal policy. The conventional view would be that if you could have a philosopher king run fiscal policy in Washington, that you'd be open to sort of more stimulus today or less fiscal restraint today in return for having more fiscal restraint in the future, which is where our more significant budget problems lurk. as we have the aging of the population, rising healthcare costs. Really, the scary part of budget projections is out in the future. And in a perfect philosopher king world, you would address both of those at once by doing, allowing the government to do more today and ratcheting in what it's planning to do in the future. Washington is not run by philosopher kings at the moment. And so we now have these policy risks that have become, in some sense, very familiar, right? We are all now very familiar with fiscal policy made by sort of manufactured crisis. So we're once again having discussions about government shutdown whenever September 30th, October 1st is, so a week from now. And then beyond that, we have the debt limit coming. Obviously, from a macroeconomic point of view, the debt limit is a vastly more important issue. There's much more money at stake. My view on that is that, first of all, the debt limit has to go up. There's no alternative. And that hopefully we will not breach it and find out what Treasury would be forced to do. And whatever those options are would be unpleasant and bad for us as a nation.
Thank you. Renaud, how does the US economy look to you? And we've heard that there is insufficient demand. And we've obviously heard a great deal about the lack of lending in the economy over the last 4 to 5 years. So how does the world look? What are the strengths and fragilities of the economy for you?
Yeah. So at Lending Club, we're really focusing on the availability and affordability of credit for both consumers and businesses. And so from that standpoint, what we're seeing is the US consumer being in a better shape than they had been for quite a while and having a balance sheet that looks better. US consumers have delivered quite a bit. I mean, if you look at the outstanding balances on credit cards, we've been going from $920 billion at the peak before the crisis to $850 billion. So that's several $100 less per family. So that balance sheet is looking better. There's more savings going on. Small businesses also benefiting from more tools made available to them, and recent legislation on crowdfunding is helping companies like ours and others make credit more available and more affordable to small businesses. So I think there are positive trends in the availability and affordability of credit. I want to say one of the weaknesses continues to be, I think, the banking system and the sort of inherent inefficiency of the US banking system. And a lot of the regulations that were put in place since the financial crisis that have had unintended effect on the banks and really prevented the banks from doing as much lending as they should.
Could you just give us a couple of examples of those?
Yeah, so there are many. One really obvious example is the Card Act of 2009 that was really designed to protect consumers against some of the practices of the credit card issuers and really prevented credit card issuers from charging some of the fees they used to charge. And their response, the credit card issuers' response has been to increase interest rates across the board to offset for the fee revenue lost as a consequence of that legislation. So that really hasn't helped consumers and have sort of introduced more friction in the system. Another example is really some of the scrutiny that the OCC is applying on some banks. I was on the phone with the chief credit officer of a major bank yesterday who was telling me that the amount of credit model validation that the OCC is imposing now has forced him to cut down on the number of credit models applied to small businesses and really cut down from 8 different models to just 2. Meaning that essentially with less credit models applicable to less different businesses, you would have to cut down on small business lending.
Yeah, interestingly, that's a point that the Atlanta Fed President Dennis Lockhart was making here yesterday morning when he was saying the tighter scrutiny of lending on borrowers through credit cards, and that's an important way of funding startup businesses, and it's had a knock-on effect into employment because it's not generating jobs from those small businesses. Dennis, could you, last but not least, but could you give us your perspective?
Yeah, sure. My name's Dennis Gartman, and I have to say I'm honored to be on this panel. When I woke up this morning in my hotel and looked at my lovely bride of 23 years, and I said, can you ever imagine that your husband was going to be on a panel with Don Marin, would be doing television shows, would be making speeches to the public in your wildest imagination, did you think this would happen? And my lovely bride took my face in her hands and said, "Sweetheart, we've been married 23 years. It's been a long time since you've been in my wildest dreams." I'm supposedly a trained economist. I got my graduate degree, but I've tried very hard in the last 40 years to overcome that fact because everything they taught me in school has proven to be utterly and completely useless and worthless. I got a better undergraduate degree in art history, which is of far greater value when trying to ascertain how an economy is functioning than is a degree in economics. I trade for my own account every day. I only have my own money at risk, and I am a trader. I look at the economy in the United States, and I'm lucky enough to live in Southern Virginia, far from the madding crowd, far from New York, far from Chicago. I used to be in the pit in Chicago, and a more aptly named place in the world there never has been. But looking from Virginia and traveling and flying in airplanes and stopping by stores and asking cab drivers and looking at port facilities, what's going on, I'm sorry, this economy is doing quite well, thank you very much. Our port in Norfolk, Virginia, which is always badly pronounced by people here in New York, our port in Norfolk, Virginia is as busy as I have seen our port facility in the past 10 years. The port in Long Beach, California is as busy as it has been in a very long period of time. The port in Savannah, Georgia is as busy as it has been in a long period of time. I don't know if you have flown much, but try to get on an airplane nowadays. You cannot. They are completely filled gunnel to gunnel. Hotels everywhere around the country. Don't talk about what's going on in New York, but my wife and I went to her 45th high school reunion last week in Cookeville, Tennessee, and we could not get a hotel room in Cookeville, Tennessee. Are you kidding me? So the economy, I'm sorry, anecdotally, seems to be doing quite a good deal better than what the data would seem to indicate. If I've learned anything in the 4 decades of being involved in markets that I have been, it's that I pay more attention nowadays to anecdote than I pay to anything else. And the anecdotes of what I see tell me that the economy is doing quite well. I think it is imperative to understand how, as the gentleman to my right was explaining, how much better the balance sheets of American consumers are than they were 6 months ago, clearly than they were 3 years ago, and phenomenally better than they were 5 years ago. And I cannot see that that is going to change anytime soon. Savings rates are up. Credit card usage is there, but people are paying their credit cards off. The balances are down. Housing values are up, which is a great thing because we do forget how important housing values are to 85% of the public. It is their largest investment, and it makes them feel demonstrably better when housing is finally, for the first time, above water level. It is going to allow people, for the first time in several years, to move when there's a job that they wanted to take and couldn't take it because they couldn't sell their house at a loss, will now be able to do so. You're going to see moving rates increase rather dramatically. I'm sorry, I think things are doing actually quite well out there, despite what the news would have you believe and despite what the data would have me believe. It's a choice of, do I believe the numbers or do I believe my lying eyes? I believe my lying eyes.
And Dennis, do your lying eyes see the same improvement across the country and the economy as a whole, or is it patchy and regional?
I live in Southern Virginia, in Norfolk. Actually, I live in a little town, Suffolk, just across from Norfolk. And if there has been a place in the United States that has been damaged by the last several years, especially by sequestration, it is Norfolk, Virginia. We are the world's largest naval base. We are the military. And we have been hurt, and yet things are doing quite well. There are help wanted signs in stores around the area that I have not seen in several years. So if we're doing okay, we're doing fine. I was down in Raleigh 2 weeks ago for an endowment committee meeting. Raleigh's doing fine. My family, where I grew up in just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, I talk to them all the time. Cleveland is doing fine. Youngstown, Ohio, a city that was absolutely and still is diametrically involved in the steel industry. Youngstown Sheet and Tube has been closed for years. It's now running 24/7 to supply pipe to the fracking industry. Things are changing, not just, things are changing around the country. So if Norfolk, Virginia is doing okay, and there's no place that has been as damaged by sequestration as we have, if we're doing okay, I suspect everything else is doing better too. Thank you very much.
Donald, that seems a good segue into the perennial existential threat to the American consumer, Congress. we're seeing, another potential round of sequestration again now with the new debate over the budget ceiling and the whole budgetary process. How much potential damage is this debate now doing, and could it do if there is no adequate resolution to this recovery that Dennis has seen?
So it depends on your political model of how bad the folks in Washington would let things actually become. Obviously, hitting the debt limit for real, we hit it back in May, but we've been doing allegedly extraordinary things that have now become normal to live within it. But we'll hit it for real sometimes around Halloween. If we persist and go a month or two beyond that, that would be a quite sudden stop for the U.S. economy. It would withdraw about $100 billion of what the federal government has been up to. That's hard to imagine. So A, it would be bad for the economy. It's very hard to imagine that Congress would actually let it get that far. But the debt limit is definitely the bigger threat than the government shutdown threat. We've seen those before. People think that maybe there'll be a day or two of shutdown, maybe there'll be none at all. From a macroeconomic point of view, that's relatively small. Although I should emphasize it is quite wasteful, right? So when you have this brinksmanship way of making decisions, you have strange things like for the next week, a large portion of the federal government will spend its time figuring out how to shut down. Right? This is not actually a productive thing for those folks to be doing, to the extent you believe that they're engaged in things that are helpful for society. And similarly, in 2011, when we went up to the brink on the debt limit, what you saw was a lot of shocks to confidence in the economy. Stock market fell. You actually saw that interest rates on short-term government bonds went up, and so as a result, we're actually paying extra in interest as a result of that debacle. This time around, it's interesting. Right? People seem calmer about it. Right? There's this belief that Washington will work it out despite the tensions. And that's one of those things that if we all get too complacent, then that puts less pressure on them to actually get their act together. Nonetheless, my modal projection is they get their act together at some point before something terrible happens.
They're stupid, but they're not completely ignorant. Okay, they will take us to the brink, but they will, of course, walk back. Always have, always shall.
I hope so.
Scott, what's the weakness in the economy that makes you think that monetary policy isn't doing enough and sufficient stimulus hasn't been applied?
Okay.
Because this is contradictory to what the sort of view we're getting from.
Yeah, well, I'm actually sort of a moderate, somewhere between Dennis's view and the real pessimistic view, which points to no recovery in the employment population ratio over the last 4 years. I think the unemployment rate is about right as an indicator. It's gone from 10 to 7.3, so there has been some recovery. Maybe I've underestimated it. What I look at, though, is nominal GDP. I think that's the single best indicator of aggregate demand, total nominal spending in the economy. If you're not an economist, think of this as the total income everyone earned in the country added together. And that normally grows at a 5% rate in a healthy economy in the US, 3% real growth, 2% inflation. So we've had this situation since late 2008 where we've had the slowest nominal GDP growth since Herbert Hoover was president. Now, back in 2003, Ben Bernanke said, don't look at interest rates, don't look at the money supply, look at inflation and nominal GDP growth. Those are the best indicators of monetary policy. So by his own criteria from 2003, we've had too little demand, too little growth in the economy. Even when that happens, you eventually do get a recovery. The economy has self-correcting mechanism, wages and prices adjust, the debt loads are reduced. There is a natural process of recovery over time. But I do think that with a healthier rate of growth in nominal GDP, closer to the norm of 5%, we would get a more robust recovery. Let's remember that, according to most indicators, this recovery has been unusually slow, certainly on the employment front, compared to other recessions. So here we are, 4 years after the deepest point. We would normally be in a boom by then, and we're still talking 7.3% unemployment.
But isn't it a function of the fact that essentially, 2008 was a credit debt crisis, and time solves debt crises. I mean, as Japan has seen. But it was so deep here that it would inevitably take so much longer for it to get back to anything approaching normal rates of growth.
I think that our crisis was different than the normal debt crisis. I agree, in normal debt crisis, it takes a long time to recover. But those are usually due to real problems in the economy. There's a few cases in history and only a few where a currency has appreciated strongly in the teeth of a crisis. As you know, usually if it's the Thai baht or the Mexican peso, they collapse during a crisis. Well, what are the few cases where currencies appreciated? America in late 2008, the dollar soared in value, an indicator of tight money. And the only earlier ones I know of is Argentina around 2000 and America in the early 30s. All three of those were where money was too tight. We now know that for certain about Argentina and America in the 30s, and I'm trying to argue that a similar mistake occurred here. So instead of being a normal financial crisis, yes, we had that to some extent with the subprime problem, but in late 2008 it got 2 or 3 times worse because when nominal spending falls, the resources people have to repay nominal debts is much lower. So we had the biggest fall in nominal GDP since the 30s, and that means there's less money for people, for businesses, and sovereign governments in Europe to repay their nominal debts. So you get this crisis whenever there's a big shock to nominal spending, nominal debts become harder to service, and you almost inevitably have a financial crisis. That's what made our crisis different from the garden variety ones, which were more due to real problems in the economy, which do take a long time to work off.
But wasn't one of the phenomena of this crisis and its aftermath is that even though interest rates were pushed down to zero, they were not having the effect of making people borrow and making companies borrow and starting to the sort of normal process of recovery. And that was the thing that was never really tackled.
Right. So
I mean, it didn't matter how cheap money was if nobody wanted to borrow it.
So the standard view of monetary policy seems to look at it in terms of interest rates, higher or lower. But that's clearly not enough of an indicator. Just think of an example like when you have hyperinflation, you tend to have very high interest rates. But no one would say money is tight because the interest rates are high, you have tremendous inflation. And when you have very tight money, what it does is it drives spending so low that the equilibrium interest rate tends to fall to zero. So ironically, the lowest interest rates are times like the 30s in America, Japan in the late 90s when you had deflation. That's actually often an indicator that money's been too tight. So what you need to do is use other approaches to monetary policy. Interest rates are not obviously a reliable approach once they hit zero. The Fed, well, Ben Bernanke in his academic writings talked about things the Japanese should be doing. Now he did one of those things, QE, but he didn't do the more powerful ones that he suggested, and I think that's because he didn't have the Federal Reserve on board with it. Those more powerful tools they have are more controversial. They put the spotlight on the Fed, things like an explicit target path for nominal spending where you promise to return to it over time. That's what he recommended the Japanese do, and we haven't seen that kind of really aggressive move out of the Fed. So you have to move away from interest rates when they fall to zero and use some more aggressive tools.
I think what was interesting to notice also in this case is that low interest rates didn't necessarily improve the supply of credit to consumers and businesses, because we were coming out not just of an economic crisis, but a credit crisis. And the interest rates to consumers and businesses has really two components to it. One is the cost of capital for the banks, and in this case it was very low, but the other is a risk premium attached by the bank to credit, and that risk premium was extremely high. Banks had lost a lot of money on subprime mortgages and other credits, and were not immediately willing, or the regulators wouldn't necessarily let them immediately extend credit in greater supply.
I tend to look at things in macro perspective, but in the past year and a half, my wife and I have become more micro-oriented because we did this stupid thing and bought our country club, which was going into bankruptcy. And because we like to play golf and we wanted to continue to play golf, we got a good deal from the bank. But what's interesting is we are exactly like most other small businesses in the United States. We have 48 employees. We're working them like dogs. We are not going to add a 50th employee for an absolute clear reason. Obamacare scares the crap out of everybody. That's a very sophisticated and esoteric economic term I just used there. And I don't think that people are understanding the severity of that impact upon the broad economy. Every small business I know in my arena, in my area, is doing exactly the same thing. And you're seeing that, the evidence of that showing up now in the fact that for the first time in a long period of time, we're actually seeing the average work week beginning to go up a tenth, a tenth, a tenth. You're going to start to see that average work week going up a tenth, and a tenth for a long period of time because businesses are simply not going to expand beyond 50 employees. Once you go beyond 50, even if you go back to 48, you're in permanently. You don't get to go back. People don't understand that fact. And as we find out about it, that is having, I think, a very severe impact upon the growth of economic activity in the United States. And anybody who doubts that is simply wrong.
Okay, so how are companies going to work their way around that? Because they're not going to suppress their natural desire to grow.
No, they're going to short-term employment. It was a wonderful, wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal this past Saturday, which has become a great newspaper, by the way. A discussion with a gentleman, I think he owns the third largest manpower organization in the country, and how his business has absolutely blown up, just expanded violently, because he's supplying those needed employees beyond the 47, beyond 50. It's made his business go dramatically higher. You're going to see that sort of thing. That's the way you have to get around it. But until people understand that, we are inhibiting the growth of employment. And that's the one drawback. I think the Fed is paying attention to the unemployment numbers, and they're missing the underlying strength of the economy, despite the non-growth in employment aggregates.
Because that's actually been one of the great contradictions of this recovery, such as this has been, is that you have seen actually quite a steady recovery.
Yes.
And you've seen unemployment coming down
Yes.
and the broader measures of underemployment coming down as well. But even now, U6, which is probably the broadest measure of unemployment that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out, I mean, that is still now a third higher than it was at the peak of the dot-com bubble recession. So, I mean, there's still a huge amount of capacity there. So the employment situation is just not it does not match the recovery in growth.
Couldn't agree more.
Actually, I would kind of dispute that. So we've had in the recovery and growth about 2% real GDP growth, a little over since 2009. And that's below our historical trend. Some people think that's the new trend, closer to 2. But even if it's close to trend, normally when you grow at trend, unemployment doesn't fall at all. The unemployment rate stays stable. So if we're growing close to trend, then we're in a sense not recovering back up to the previous prosperity. And so in a sense, to me, what's puzzling is why unemployment's gone from 10 down to 7.3. On the other side, there is data that supports your point too. The initial claims for unemployment, the weekly
Record
claims,
lows.
they fall into virtually record lows. Boom conditions, I would
Yeah.
say. That's puzzling. But here's one issue with the sort of supply side argument here. Let's suppose that the economy is closer to full employment than we think, and that we've got some supply side problems. Then the question is, why is the monetary stimulus not causing inflation? I mean, even if the government's wrong about the real state of the economy, employment, maybe there's people working off the books, they're not recorded
Bingo.
to avoid taxes and so
Bingo.
on. Let's say all that real growth is stronger than we think. Shouldn't then this monetary stimulus be showing up in inflation? Inflation over the last 12 months is a little over 1% using the Fed's preferred index, 1.5, I think, on the CPI, or 1.8. That's actually a little below their target. So we're not seeing confirmation of supply side problems in the inflation rate. So there's a lot of puzzles here in the data.
I will guarantee you one thing. My inflation is demonstrably higher than is the Fed's measurement for inflation. I would think that every single person in here would say that their inflation rate is demonstrably higher than is the Fed's number for inflation.
I mean, if you're paying healthcare, if you're paying
Your
college
inflation
fees,
rate is astronomical.
Yeah.
It is well beyond 1%. It is closer to 7%, and it's rising.
But just also the other reason why we're not seeing those inflationary pressures and the inflationary expectations is because the U.S. economy isn't a hermetically sealed unit. I mean, it's actually operating now in a global economy where recovery is very slow. In Europe, it's recession or just out of recession, depending on presumably whether you're looking at it from the north or the south of the continent. China has slowed. The Asian emerging markets have slowed along with China. Japan is only now starting to grow after basically a decade and a half of being becalmed. So aren't these globalizing factors other reasons that the U.S. economy isn't growing any faster than it is, and that we're not seeing these inflationary expectations?
So, which I'd say, to echo something Scott said, I mean, so there are some mysteries here, right? It's a little hard to get all of the data to add up to a model that makes sense. If you believe, in fact, that inflation is understated by the government and instead of running at 1% to 2% is actually running at 7%, then you have a problem that would suggest that the economy is in a severe recession. if you believe that the government is correctly calculating the amount of nominal GDP that's happening. And so if you believe that the economy is stronger and you believe inflation is high, then you ought to believe that the nominal size of the economy is growing much more rapidly. And, it's hard to make all the pieces fit together in a coherent vision.
Let me add one additional problem, and I agree with what you said. So wage growth, which was around 3.5% before the recession, it's dropped down to about 2% and stayed there. Now, wage growth, that's the real domestic part of the economy, and that's a huge part of what's called the core CPI. So when you go pay for a haircut or something, you're basically paying for wages. And wages are a big part of the economy. If they're only growing at 2%, that suggests the labor market is depressed even today relative to the situation before. Remember, it's hard to cut people's nominal wages. There's resistance to that. So as a practical matter, in a modern economy, you don't get wage growth much below 2%. Some people are getting 0, some are getting 4. But when I look at the labor market, which is a domestic part of our economy, I see this too. And you're right about global conditions. That's weighing on the U.S. to some extent, and import prices factor in. But wages, and that data I think has to be pretty accurate. Even if they're wrong about the inflation data, let's say it's 7%. I think the wage data, that fits what people are observing. Well, that would mean real wages would be falling at 5% a year, and then we would probably be in deeper trouble than we are if it was really that high. So that would be.
But what about the labor market? Just people dropping out of the labor market. I mean, that's one reason that the unemployment rate has come down is because labor participation ratios are dropping. So if that's happening, I mean, is what we're really seeing here that the economy is just growing below its long-term potential because so much of the productive workforce is just melting away?
Well, it's aging out. There's a secondary baby boom going on out there. A lot of women are dropping out to have children. That really is taking place. There are a number of factors as to why that employment number is, I think, confusing, for lack of a better term.
Although I think net for net, it is felt that the fall off in labor force participation
is large.
Is real. Yeah,
it's real. No question. It's large.
It's a mixture of partly things that can be explained, like baby boomers starting to retire, but as you say, it's more than that. So there's this X factor that we don't understand. Maybe students staying in college longer because of the weak job market. Yep. Some people going on disability because they become discouraged. A variety of factors, and it is not fully explained why the labor force participation rate has gone down so much and stayed low in this crisis.
A large number of people going on disability because they lie. I'm sorry, that's a real problem here in the United States.
Well, yeah, it's sort of a fallback welfare system. If you're older, you've worked a difficult job, and you can't find a job, it's sort of the easy way out to go on disability.
I have too many friends who are orthopedic surgeons that I play golf with who explain to me how many people they are now seeing for that want their disability proven. People who are out playing golf, people who are out running, and people who are asking for disability. It's garbage.
No, I mean, I think that's a very well-observed phenomenon, that it is an alternative to unemployment for people who are effectively now redundant from the workforce.
Yes.
But anyway,
So I think besides workforce participation, which is obviously going down at a rapid rate, the other two components of unemployment are really job creations and job losses. And what we've seen in our data as a lender, I mean, we're very sensitive to the pace of job losses, obviously, because folks losing their job would later default on their loans. And certainly a lot of the data shows that the pace of job losses had slowed down tremendously. So there are less and less mass layoffs in particular. But the pace of job creation hasn't picked up as fast as we would like it to pick up, which has implication in economic terms, but also has a lot of social implications with more and more people going into long-term unemployment and really a lot of families hurting as a result.
can I also just go back to something you talked earlier about the attitudes of the banks and the big banks and the immediate response to the 2008 crisis, which was with the risk of systemic failure, there was a policy decision taken to recapitalize the banks, sensible thing in the heat of crisis. And a lot of then effort was put into, I mean, recapitalizing the banks means essentially letting them make a lot of profits. One of the way you make a lot of profits is you don't make a lot of bad loans, as they had done in the past. So have the big banks come not too risk adverse, because clearly they still have an appetite for risk, but too loan averse? And was the way that the big banks were handled in the immediate aftermath of 2008 in retrospect not optimal?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case, and again, there's been sort of a lot of sort of credit losses at the banks that explains the pessimistic view that a lot of chief credit officers now at the banks are making, and that's going to come back, and they'll get into sort of lending mode again. But there's really also the attitude of the regulators that were really sort of, focusing more on the solvability of the banking system and less on giving incentives to banks to lend again. There was a recent survey by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that showed that 65% of small business owners are telling us that they do not have the capital they need to grow their business. That's an alarming statistics if we're already in a recovery situation.
So what are the ways around that? I mean, again, from the perspective of someone who does make loans, I mean, what are the ways that can be got around traditional means of bank lending and bank credit scoring to help, maybe particularly help small businesses?
Yeah, so I think some of what Lending Club is doing and a lot of other sort of innovative companies are bringing to the table is a lower cost structure that helps make more loans and have a more inclusive policy. Because costs for banks come from operating costs and credit losses. So if you lower operating costs, you can afford slightly higher credit losses. But also by sort of being fully online, and there's a lot of these companies in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, by having a really deep understanding of the fabric of the internet, we are able to collect more data and build more indicators of business performance over time that do not necessarily appear in traditional credit underwriting or in the financials of the businesses, but can be captured by sort of measure of a business's customer satisfaction or how a sort of business is trending on Google, how they link popularity to the website of a business, Yelp reviews or reviews on OpenTable. I mean, all these data sources that are available online that more and more companies are making available through an API and making that data available to lenders like us. This is really a very positive trend that is helping make more credit available to small businesses.
I'm very much looking forward to the day when the Federal Reserve statements are now concentrating on Yelp reviews. That will be make reporting on those very different.
Don't hold your breath.
Donald, maybe you could take this one, which is picking up on this question of the banking regulation. I mean, was enough done or not enough done in terms of bank reform? And clearly the system is safer than it was, but one, is it safe enough? And is the regulation a wet blanket over the recovery of financial services, or is it necessary protection for consumers?
So yes. So it's a complicated beast, right? We went through this terrible downturn that revealed a lot of problems in the system, various efforts to try to rein that in. It is an incredibly complex system. The writing of the regulations has taken longer than anticipated. Their actual effects in many cases are yet to be known, right? You gave the example in the credit card space where, people make reforms and it's only over time you learn what the implications are. And then in principle, you then need to course correct from that. And we're not done with that process. We're I don't even know how to gauge how far we are with that process, maybe halfway through the process. And so you have concerns that have gone too far in some directions. You have other concerns from some folks that we haven't solved the too big to fail problem. In Washington, it's often fun to think about policy interventions as one-time solutions to big problems. So we'll pass Dodd-Frank and all these problems will be gone, or we'll pass health reform and all these problems will be solved. And that just isn't the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is an ongoing iterative process where we make changes, we learn from them, and we course correct. And we're very much in the middle of that process.
And is there a political system that is in place that can work with that, sort of very...
So it's a little
iterative
difficult.
process?
The course correction part is a little painful and difficult to do at the moment. There are sort of these spikes, moments when it's possible to adjust things. If you look at the health reform discussion at the moment, for example, the political debate is a very black and white yes-no kind of discussion. Whereas at some point on the trajectory we're on, the health reform will go into effect and we're going to have to switch to a tweaking dials, changing the policy to fix problems as they emerge. But we're nowhere near that yet on health reform.
I think this might be a good point to open it up to the floor so we can hear your questions. There's a question there I saw, arm raised there. If you could just wait for the microphone to arrive, which is just behind you, and just say who you are and to whom you're addressing your question.
Works, okay. I'm Ben Nelson from the Minerva Project. I have a question on the inflation, because it is definitely something that's been confounding me. You look at personal inflation, you look at cost of, groceries and college and cars and everything else. Seems like inflation is quite high. The statistics are quite low. And as a business owner, my question is, what do you think is the implication on wages? And how do you see wage adjustment happening in light of this very strange, is it non-inflationary or quite inflationary period?
Scott, do you want to start with that?
Let me just say, I think I'm a lot older than you, and to me, inflation seems very low. I lived through the 70s, and to me, high inflation is when you go buy a car and it's $4,000, your next car is $8,000, your next car is $16,000. You really notice it rapidly in ordinary products. Now, I think a lot of people focus exclusively on things that change frequently in price, that are noticeable, like gasoline and food and so on. But those go both up and down in price. If you look at sort of the broad consumer basket, in recent years, the price changes have been much lower. I mean, car prices haven't gone up much in the last 20 years, 25 years even. So when we really have 7-10% inflation rates, like we had in the 70s, it's very visible. Wages are also going up at 7 to 10%. So I'm a skeptic on this view that inflation is actually higher than, it's perhaps a little bit higher than the government measurement, but not radically higher. And I think there's a psychological bias people have to only think about the rising prices. If you talk to someone about inflation, especially in an area where housing prices have plummeted, and say to them, yes, but in your town, a $500,000 house is only $300,000. So look at the price of houses has fallen dramatically. They'll sort of scratch their heads and say, well, but isn't that bad? And in their own mind, they've associated inflation with bad. So you see what I mean? They're not thinking of that as deflation, as something that offsets the rise in gasoline. So I do think there's a psychological tendency to overestimate the inflation rate. That's just my own view.
But does that mean that there isn't going to be pressure on wages from inflation,
Right.
which I think was what the question was getting at?
So absolutely. And wages tend to follow nominal GDP growth, interestingly, more than inflation. So in 2008, when we had the big spike in oil prices, we had quite a bit of inflation that year, but wages were very well behaved in terms of slow growth because nominal GDP was growing slowly. So nominal GDP is the total income available to pay out into wages. If that's not going up fast, wages aren't going to go up very fast. And that's where we've been the last 5 years.
John, I think you had a question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So,
Right.
so the thing I'm hearing, though, is you're treating the economy as if it's a unitary item. What I see where I live, which is in Cambridge, or the people I know on the West Coast, are indeed experiencing 7% and 10% inflation in everything except commodities, which are sold across the entire country, like cars. So the things that you measure in your consumer price index are things, and the averaging across the country misses the fact that in big chunks of this country, you're seeing dramatic growth in price of food and services and in wages. I teach at a university. We get to have students go out and start jobs. the wages my students get are going up astronomically. Now, if I lived in Cleveland, they'd be dropping. And so there seems to be this tie between, types of industry, location, and inflation that I, as old as you, have not seen before because it seems to be persistent and systematic. Do you want to comment on that?
I also live in the Boston area, and Boston to me seems like it's booming. So when I'm talking about the economy, I'm relying on data, not my own lying eyes, to use your phrase. Yeah, I mean, and wages are rising because the labor market is tighter there. But I have to think Boston is not typical of the whole United States. And you're sort of indicating that too. Cleveland is very different. So obviously these macro variables, we're looking at the whole economy. And by the way, that problem is even worse in Europe, where the unevenness between Germany and Greece is even greater. So, but you can only have one monetary policy. So you have to set that at the best for the average.
Excuse me, why?
Well,
Because you don't have enough manpower to do things differently?
no, you'd have to have more than one currency to have more than one monetary policy. So we have a single currency throughout the U.S. Europe could have different ones. They used to.
Tax regimes, you can have different
Oh, yes.
banking support and regulation. You can have very different monetary policies.
Well, I'm using the term monetary policy very in the narrow sense of
Narrow
control
sense.
the money supply and interest rate. Yes, you could have different regulatory rules in booming areas versus so on. Yeah, I meant monetary more narrowly.
Some of the traditional things, but just like in Europe, you have these countries, we have states here. And
Sure.
they can have very different regimes operation.
Well, and Europe made a mistake in even abandoning their individual
Yeah,
currencies. They could have had completely separate monetary policies if they'd held on to their currencies, and they wouldn't be in this bind they're in right now.
Are you a Eurosceptic?
The EU is great, but the euro was a disaster.
You
I mean,
betcha.
it couldn't have failed
betcha.
in a more dramatic way
I couldn't
if
agree
you
more.
tried to write a script.
Yep.
It was an utter disaster.
Yeah.
So during the economic downturn in the early 1990s, I believe I have time period right, I am told by economists who know that Governor Dukakis asked his advisors whether Massachusetts could introduce its own currency so that they could stimulate their own economy. But that turned out not to go anywhere.
So we're going to get Bitcoin or somebody like that coming in and destabilizing the Fed but creating monetary policy of its own, because we're going to be able to create virtual currencies. And in fact, the Dukakis solution will be possible.
Well, so I've been studying up on Bitcoin because I have nothing better to do. And I don't think it's going to disrupt monetary policy anytime soon. It's a very interesting model, but it's one that doesn't, it basically takes monetary policy off the table because there's just a process by which you create a fixed number of them, and that's the story. There is no centralized authority that will create more of them or reduce the number of them out there.
Or so they say. I mean, who's to stop from creating more Bitcoins? I mean,
Who writes the algorithm? That's the question.
Right, so the algorithm is publicly available. It's based on cryptography. We will rapidly reach the limit of my understanding of cryptography. But thus far, after 4 years, no one has managed to do that.
Okay, I think we might be going down a rabbit hole here. So
Yes.
let's see, where's the next question coming from? John.
Right. This question was for Scott, but any of you can answer it. You're talking about having a more easing in the monetary policy. But what tools does the Federal Reserve have to do that? You know, when Bernanke did his, even suggested that we might have a tightening of monetary policy, look what happened. The 10-year treasuries went up by 100 basis points. So what tools does the Federal Reserve have to affect the economy in the way you'd like to see it?
Well, one tool is to not do what he did,
Yeah.
which is, as you said, his talk supposedly contributed to higher interest rates. And that was a contractionary move, right? Talking about ending tapering.
He was testing the waters, definitely.
Right. So the first thing you do is you do not taper when nominal GDP growth is not adequate. And you see, one of the problems people have is most people look at the Fed as being sort of out of ammunition, like they've tried to stimulate the economy and they failed. And yet the Fed has never said that. Throughout the entire crisis, Bernanke has insisted the Fed could do more, but it's choosing not to. That's a very important distinction. The most important tool they have is actually the hardest to explain, which is to set a higher target path. Because the target path itself has an enormous effect on aggregate demand today. If they were to signal a higher target path for inflation or nominal GDP, that would provide a tremendous boost to demand in the economy today. In addition to that, they could do more QE, they could stop paying interest on reserves. They're actually paying banks interest to sit on the money, to not put it in circulation. They've only been doing that since 2008. It's a contractionary policy. They could stop that. If they really got desperate, they could even put a negative interest rate on bank reserves to literally force the money into circulation. So they have so many tools that would get them much further down the road that they haven't even used. And they've consistently said they have more tools, but they feel that this is the right stance of policy.
Is Abe doing the right thing in Japan?
Yes, and so Japan is an excellent example. A lot of people that were skeptical of my views used to argue, well, there's nothing the Japanese can do. They're stuck. Monetary policy is out of ammunition. As soon as Abe set a higher inflation target path of 2% instead of 0, things started to look up. Now, it's too early to know whether they'll persist with this policy, but already all sorts of data has been much more positive out of Japan in the last 6 months, both market data showing expectations and the GDP growth in the last 6 months has been stronger. So, and they've depreciated their currency. Remember that the people that are skeptical about monetary policy, I don't know if you're familiar with the term liquidity trap, this view actually implies that countries would not even be able to depreciate their currency. If it were really true that the 0 interest rate meant you couldn't do anything, one of those things you could not do was depreciate your currency. As soon as the Japanese decided to go down this road, the yen fell sharply in the foreign exchange markets. So that alone shows that policy was not out of ammunition.
If Kuroda, who originally embraced Abe's regime enthusiastically and has seemed to have stood down from that aggressive embrace, if Kuroda would get back online, you could see you'd see the Nikkei soaring again, just as it was. Mm-hmm. You'd see the yen go to 150, as it should be, probably. But Mr. Kuroda has stood down a little bit in the past couple of weeks. I found that disconcerting,
yes.
and I think ill-advised on his part.
Isn't that the case with Japan, that the Abenomics won't work unless they carry through with the structural reforms as well? Is that the hyper-expansionary monetary policy and the setting of the 2% inflation target has provided a sort of initial kickstart to get basically a becalmed economy going again. But that will fade relatively quickly, and if the structural reforms aren't carried through, which are politically difficult as they are in every country.
Well, Abe should do two things. He should stop with the notion of raising the consumption tax, which is nonsense, and he should say instead of a 2% inflation rate, make it 4%. I mean, he really should become far more aggressive than he has thus far.
But aren't you going to get into a fight then with markets if Abe is showing no attempt to cut Japan's huge public debt?
Japan's huge public debt has been huge for the past 2 decades. It's going to get huger. It's not going to get any smaller. So what?
Well, you have the counter argument in the US, isn't it? That something's got to be done about deficits because the public debt is growing so much.
One thing that makes it easier to reduce public debt is to sort of raise the denominator of the debt GDP number. So in Japan, as you know, that's up to scary high levels.
It's 220 or 225.
Their nominal GDP is lower than 20 years ago. That's actually a mind-boggling statistic. I don't know of any other time in world history where something like that has happened. Nominal means the total amount of actual income earned by everyone in Japan
is lower.
Not real, but total nominal is lower than 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so any budget deficits that raise the debt are going to make that ratio get larger and larger when nominal GDP is shrinking. So even if the budget deficits stay the same size in Japan, raising nominal GDP growth will help. But by the same token, you're absolutely right that structural reform is needed because demand is only part of the problem there. They don't have enough real growth from productivity and job creation.
Shall they ever?
So they need
the demographics are so egregiously skewed against them. Are they ever going to have an increase in consumer consumption? No, it's probably not going to happen.
Let's, again, not go down the rabbit hole. It's just meant to be a panel on the US economy rather than Japanese economy. We have time for one last question, I think, if...
There's a young lady over here.
Young lady over there. And the microphone is coming your way.
Shadan Azali with the Earth Institute at Columbia University. I just want to get an idea of what your opinions are regarding the Detroit bankruptcy issue that's currently going on right now in terms of how that's affecting the manufacturing sector along with the automotive sector and just in general, being the largest U.S. city to ever file for bankruptcy, and what that actually has to do, or how the effects are with the entire country as a whole.
It's the first of many. It's a good thing. They need to declare bankruptcy. They need to get rid of their pensions. They need to make those sorts of reforms, and the only way to get that done is through bankruptcy.
Any other views?
So I just offered that, I mean, so obviously Detroit is an exceptional case. Large, it's lost population, it's lost a lot of economic activity. I think it will be, as just suggested, I think it will be a leading edge of this discussion about how you handle employee pensions for the municipalities that don't necessarily have the ability to cover them. And it will be an important test case of that.
Scott, any final thoughts?
All I know is they have a very valuable art collection, but I don't know if that's the best solution. No, I'm not really an expert on the Detroit situation.
I think Pennsylvania went bust like 150 years ago, and it seems to have recovered, so presumably long-term.
Cleveland went bust under, I'm trying to remember who the silly mayor that they had back in the 1960s. Cleveland? Kucinich, idiot. Cleveland went bust, and it survived.
Okay, I think time has probably defeated us, so if I just ask you to please show your appreciation to your panel. Thank you very much.